Picture yourself walking through mist-covered valleys in southern France, where ancient stones whisper secrets older than memory itself. The air carries the scent of wild thyme and lavender, but beneath that sweetness lies something deeper, something that makes your skin prickle with recognition. You're standing in the Languedoc, a region that once pulsed with a different kind of Christianity, one that would shake the very foundations of medieval Europe and leave behind a legacy so dangerous it had to be erased from history. But what if it wasn't completely erased? What if fragments survived, hidden in bloodlines that stretch back centuries before the Knights Templar ever set foot in Jerusalem? Tonight, we descend into the shadowed world of the Cathars, those mysterious perfect ones whose beliefs were so threatening to Rome that an entire civilization was put to the sword to silence them forever. This isn't just another tale of medieval heresy. This is the story of a forbidden legacy that predates the Crusades, one that challenges everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christian mysticism in Europe. And at its heart lies a question that still echoes through the centuries. What did the Cathars truly believe, and why were they considered so dangerous that their very existence had to be obliterated? Settle into the darkness now. Let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back 900 years to a time when the Pyrenees Mountains sheltered communities that dared to live by a different gospel. A gospel that spoke not of earthly power, but of pure spirit. Not of grand cathedrals, but of humble gatherings in hidden caves. And not of priests who claimed divine authority, but of men and women who believed the divine lived within every human soul. The year is 1140, and the morning sun filters through the shutters of a modest stone house in the village of Olby. Inside, a woman named Esclamonde tends to her herbs, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she prepares remedies for the sick. To any passing observer, she appears unremarkable, another village healer going about her daily tasks. But Esclamonde carries within her something far more precious than knowledge of medicinal plants. She is one of the perfecti, the perfect ones, and the light she claims to carry has been passed down through generations of believers who trace their spiritual ancestry to sources that predate Rome's dominion over Christian thought. The Cathars didn't appear suddenly in the 12th century like some spontaneous religious movement. Their roots run deeper, threading back through centuries of underground tradition, through the Bogomils of Bulgaria, through the Paulicians of Armenia, and perhaps even further back to the very earliest Christian communities that flourished in the shadows of the Roman Empire. These weren't rebels inventing new doctrines. They were inheritors of something ancient, something that had been carefully preserved and passed down through bloodlines that remembered when Christianity looked very different than the version proclaimed from papal thrones. In the quiet valleys of Occitania, these inheritors had found refuge, the counts and nobles of the region, many of whom shared Cathar sympathies, provided protection from the increasingly aggressive orthodoxy spreading southward from Paris and Rome. Here, in castles perched on limestone cliffs and in simple village homes, a different understanding of the divine flourished. The Cathars spoke of two worlds, one of spirit and light, another of matter and darkness. They taught that the material world was a prison, created not by a loving God, but by a malevolent force that sought to trap pure souls in flesh. But it was more than theology that made them dangerous. The Cathars possessed something that threatened the very structure of medieval society. They claimed direct access to the divine, requiring no priests, no sacraments, no elaborate hierarchy to mediate between the human soul and God. Their perfecti, both men and women, lived lives of such austere purity that even their enemies admitted their moral superiority to the corrupt clergy of Rome. They owned no property, ate no meat, took no oaths, and engaged in no violence. They were living reproaches to everything the established church had become. More threatening still was their treatment of women. While Rome declared that women had no souls and could not approach the divine directly, the Cathars welcomed women as equals in their spiritual hierarchy. Female perfecti preached, taught, and administered the consolamentum, their most sacred ritual. This wasn't mere progressive thinking. This was a return to something older, a tradition that remembered when the feminine held equal place in the sacred mysteries. The bloodlines that carried these beliefs weren't just spiritual inheritors, they were genetic ones as well. Families in the Languedoc could trace their ancestry back generations through marriages that carefully preserved not just property and titles, but sacred knowledge. The House of Trencavel, the Counts of Foix, the Lords of Cabaret. These weren't just political dynasties, they were custodians of a legacy that connected them to the very foundations of Christian mysticism. In the castle of Montségur, perched impossibly high on its rocky peak, the most precious elements of this legacy were safeguarded. Here, the last great Cathar library was maintained, containing texts that the Church had spent centuries trying to destroy. Gospels that spoke of Jesus in ways that contradicted official doctrine. Treatises on the nature of the soul that drew from sources older than Christianity itself, and genealogies that traced the spiritual lineage of the perfecti back through the centuries. The castle served as more than a fortress. It was a temple, its very architecture designed according to sacred principles that aligned with celestial movements. The Cathars understood geometry as a divine language, and Montségur was their greatest expression of this knowledge. During the summer solstice, the rising sun would illuminate specific chambers within the castle, marking moments of particular spiritual significance. This wasn't coincidence. This was intentional design by people who understood that the material world, however flawed, could still reflect celestial truths. As word of these communities spread, so did alarm in Rome and Paris. Here were Christians who claimed to be more Christian than the Church itself, who lived in poverty while bishops wallowed in luxury, who preached love while the Orthodox preached submission. Worse still, they were gaining converts not through force or political pressure, but through the simple power of their example. Noble families were abandoning Orthodox Christianity for this older, purer path. Entire regions were slipping away from papal control. The response, when it came, would be swift and merciless. But for now, in these golden decades of the 12th century, the Cathars lived and loved and passed down their sacred knowledge to children who would carry it forward into an uncertain future. They gathered in hidden groves to sing their hymns to the God of Light. They copied their precious manuscripts by candlelight. They prepared for the storm they knew was coming. The storm arrived with the sound of hooves on cobblestone and the glint of morning light on steel. It was the year 1208, and Pope Innocent III had grown tired of gentle persuasion. The Cathars had been given every opportunity to abandon their heretical ways, to bend the knee to Rome's authority, to accept that salvation came only through the Church's sacraments. They had refused. Now there would be consequences. The papal legate Pierre de Castelnau lay dead on the banks of the Rhône River, struck down by an unknown assassin. Whether the killer acted on Cathar orders or from his own hatred of Rome's interference mattered little now. The Pope had his justification, and within months the machinery of holy war was grinding into motion. This wouldn't be a distant crusade against Muslim infidels in far-off Jerusalem. This would be a crusade against Christians, fought on French soil, waged against communities that had lived in peace for generations. But something curious happened in those final months before the armies arrived. Across the Languedoc, ancient rituals were performed with unusual frequency. The consolamentum, that mysterious rite that transformed ordinary believers into perfecti, was administered to dozens, then hundreds of people. Children barely old enough to understand the words were brought forward to receive blessings that their parents hoped might protect them through the darkness ahead. And in the deepest chambers of certain castles, older ceremonies were conducted. Rites that had nothing to do with Christianity at all. These were the blood rituals, practices so secret that even most Cathars knew nothing of them. They were performed only by the oldest families, those whose lineages stretched back not just centuries, but millennia, back to the Druids who had once called these hills sacred, back to the mystery schools that had flourished here when Rome was still a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber. The Cathars might have inherited Christian mysticism, but beneath that inheritance lay something far more ancient. The ritual required 13 participants, always conducted during the dark of the moon, always in chambers carved from living rock. The participants would form a circle around a stone altar that had been old when the Romans arrived, its surface worn smooth by countless generations of hands. They would speak words in a language that predated Latin, predated even the Celtic tongues that had once echoed through these valleys, and they would make offerings, not of bread or wine, but of their own blood, letting it drip onto the ancient stone while they recited genealogies that connected them to powers older than any church. These bloodlines weren't just carriers of spiritual knowledge. They were genetic repositories of something that couldn't be written in books or carved in stone. It lived in their very cells, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, a biological inheritance that made certain individuals capable of accessing states of consciousness that others could only dream of. The church called it heresy, but the families knew it by its older name, the Awakening. Young Guilabert de Castro, barely 16, and already marked for greatness among the perfecti, felt the weight of this inheritance as he knelt in the hidden chamber beneath his family's castle. The stone was cold against his knees, but he could feel something pulsing within it, a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. The other participants moved around him like shadows, their faces painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. This wasn't Christianity, not even the pure Christianity of the Cathars. This was something that had existed when the world was young, when the barriers between the material and spiritual realms were thinner than morning mist. As the ritual reached its climax, Guilabert felt something crack open within his consciousness. The chamber seemed to expand infinitely in all directions, becoming a vast cosmic space filled with lights that weren't quite stars. He could see the threads that connected all living things, golden filaments of energy that pulsed with divine purpose. More than that, he could see the bloodlines themselves, rivers of light flowing through time, connecting him to ancestors whose names had been forgotten, but whose essence lived on in his DNA. The vision lasted only moments, but when it ended, Guilabert understood something that would have horrified the papal armies marching toward his homeland. The Cathars weren't just another Christian sect. They were the inheritors of humanity's oldest spiritual tradition, one that had survived every attempt at suppression by adapting, hiding, flowing like water around the stones that tried to dam its passage. And that tradition lived not in books or buildings, but in the blood of certain families who had guarded it across millennia. The armies came with fire and sword, but they could not burn what lived in the blood itself. As the flames of Montségur rose into the night sky and the last perfecti walked singing into their pyre, something essential had already slipped away into the darkness, carried by survivors who understood that the truest treasures cannot be destroyed by earthly powers. The Cathars may have vanished from history's pages, but their forbidden legacy flows still through bloodlines that remember when the divine and human were one, waiting for the day when the world is ready to hear their ancient song once more.